Jane Marie, thanks for joining me today on the podcast. Welcome. But yeah, before we get on with our conversation, I just want to understand what's brought you here and if you can share a little bit with the listeners in terms of your story.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. So, I wrote a book called Screens and the Ego, a meditation on Gen Z. And it's difficult to describe a book or pretty much what someone is trying to accomplish with art in a single pitch. But one of the main points that I want to talk to you about is that a lot of my personal experiences and the people who I know have had really ineffective therapy. When I was an RA, a lot of the girls who I was speaking to were seeing counselors who were actively exacerbating their issues. I had I thought that I should seek mental health treatment just because I was feeling sad and not good about myself, and I had
Yeah.
a lot of social anxiety related to social media and stuff, which is all really normal. But the these emotional issues used to be relegated to high school, and kids in college were experiencing them. I was experiencing them when I was in college. So I saw a therapist who actively made my feelings of self-consciousness worse because she kept telling me like, oh, I definitely understand. It makes sense that you would feel this way when someone says this. And I got into an echo chamber of my own anxiety. During COVID, I worked as a youth specialist in a facility for female wards of the state whose behavior is too extreme for foster care placement. Now, that job is a very difficult job. It's difficult for everybody who works there, and anyone who has to work in that environment. I'm so impressed that they've been able to continue because I think that I went into that job thinking that I was going to be a mentor, but the level of dysfunction that you have to have in order to not be able to be placed in a foster home, you have to get extra support, kind of result in a environment that feels more like jail than it does like a home. And youth specialists are a little bit more jail guard. There's no way to say it other than the fact that it was just really controlled. And the point is that we tried to do mental health treatment with the girls every single day, and I didn't see anyone get better. And now, also, we can talk about this a little bit more.
Or
I, the level of, um, as trauma gets worse, the lines between trauma and psychosis kind of blur. So we're talking about a really extreme segment of the population. But in both my experience as an RA in college and then also working as a youth specialist, I saw that mental health treatment was just really ineffective. We were offering really vapid solutions to really serious issues. And one of the ways that you can understand what is common to humanity is by examining how frequently a belief appears across cultures and throughout time.
right.
And mental health is a very modern Western phenomenon,
Yeah.
whereas the concept of a soul is about 4,000 years old, maybe older, and it has expanded throughout many cultures, right? Contextualizing your internal life in this very medicalized mental health way versus the way that our ancestors for the past 4,000 years have been talking about their soul caused me to write my book, Screens and the Ego, a meditation on Gen Z. And one of the main things that I talk about is the value of thinking about your internal life the way that our grandparents did. That's my spiel.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I do want to get into that whole notion of why this whole secularized view on mental health has become so prominent and why so many people are clinging to it. However, what I'm hearing though, and just to ground ourselves a little bit, there's one issue I think what you're saying is you touched on the example of social media, but a lot of the issues we're seeing, and perhaps an element of even just the title of your book, Then Z, is there a sense that a lot of this mental health struggle or the issues we're seeing with that generation is more self-induced?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think that there's any time in recorded history that people have had more resources available to them. And yet people are so miserable and so isolated. And that's not a new phenomenon. Like
Right.
in France, when there was still an aristocracy, they had like most of the people were poor and they were like doing things that were really grounded in material reality, right? But there was a certain class that had access to all the wealth that they could have access to at that time. And they found that the people who were on top were feeling like feelings of sadness that were inexplicable, and they called it ennui, Enui. And it's as if the entire world is feeling that. It's not just relegated to like kings and lords in aristocratic France. Like everybody is so disassociated from reality, from themselves. And I do think that it's a little bit self-imposed because constantly thinking about yourself results in you both hyperfixating on your flaws and also always prioritizing yourself. So it just is something that you can solve by getting grounded in a moral philosophy like you spend a lot of time thinking about your moral philosophy and developing your own internal strength so you
That's so
can solve it.
yeah, yeah, and I think to along those lines, it is this kind of self-aggrandizement of yourself, right? This grandiosity that can be a problem, and often that is how people try to battle shame, but that can have its own. But then the other piece you touched on was also in your experience, there's a lot of trying to quickly fix or provide solutions to people that perhaps had more serious issues. So what I'm hearing from that then is there are limitations also to the type of mental health care that we can provide. And I do see that because a lot of the times I'll just use my personal experience when I'm working with clients, therapy only gets them so far. And I think this kind of feeds into what you touched on, the whole notion of the soul. So I read about transpersonal psychology, and that was the idea behind it, is that people can have, it's almost like you're growing in two ways. So you've got your cognitive development happening, and there's no like order to it. You can have your spiritual development in parallel. But some people, especially when they're going for therapy, their focus is primarily on that cognitive development. And once they've achieved a certain state, now they're like, what's next? What's more? And a lot of these clients I was working with, okay, they had certain challenges that we all do with stressors in life, and obviously perhaps even trauma from childhood. But they were like, okay, there's got to be more. And what I was able to get them to think about was, what the purpose of your life here? What's the meaning behind it? What do you think about spirituality? Like, how do you see yourself growing in that space? And there's no one definition, because obviously people have their own religious beliefs or some don't. So I think that's what you're touching on, at least from what I understand, is there are people that do have certain serious issues, but is therapy the right approach? And how does that tie into some of the ancestral work that was happening for millennia around the spiritual development and finding that purpose and meaning in our life? And I don't know. I think that may have just existed since the beginning of time, right? We don't know as far as we can go back from what's written or the symbology there. Yeah, we can put a date to it, but we don't know what's going on before that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. This- er, I'd like to separate the idea of the most extreme, like how you treat the most extreme people who are struggling with like alcohol or anybody in that category, and then just like the general philosophy of the way that you think about yourself. building off of the point that you made, what is the linguistic difference between saying I have depression and I'm grieving, right? What's the difference between saying I'm grieving and I have PTSD? If you describe the way that I came about this idea is because my grandma is an Arab American woman and she is unfamiliar with mental health terms. And actually there's pretty significant like percentages of the population in the Middle East who just don't believe in
Mhm.
mental health. And it's because the language that is available to them to describe their own internal lives is still based on religious terms, right? So what's the difference between saying I'm grieving and I have PTSD? Grieving implies that something external to you happened and you are having an emotional response that is proportional to what is going on around you. Saying I have PTSD means that I am having a medical disassociation that is far disproportionate to the situation that I'm in, or I need medication or I need therapy. And that's not to dissuade people from getting therapy if you need it. Like I said, like I sought out therapy when I needed it. But it is to say that if I was the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, I would really like it that general people contextualize their internal pain in a medical way because I could sell a lot more drugs. I there this idea that you're approaching your own negative emotions as things that need to be corrected is not the way that human beings thought about it. And then one more point about history is that I think that I am not smarter than every person who came before me up until 1972, right? So I believe in looking at history and thinking, hey, like the people who came before me probably did feel really strong negative emotions. And they probably did have a way of thinking about those emotions that brought them peace. And the way that they did that was through the Abrahamic faith, which is what I'm most familiar with. And in that way of thinking, God, the fate of your immortal soul is based on your behavior, right? So the system that they have developed is that if you act respectable, then you will respect yourself and God will respect you and you will be right with the world. And you don't have to worry about if you're good or if you're bad or if you're enough or if you're not enough because the the actions that you have done will inform you on the quality of your person, and your entire life needs to be centered around right action, and that will automatically put you right inside. It'll like order your insides correctly, right?
Mhm.
And I think that just has so much more substance to it as a philosophy of as a philosophy that pertains to large numbers of people, because that way people never have to worry about if they're good enough because they always know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, right? And I think people do get stuck in it. There's a lot of shame around it. And we touched on the whole self-induced anxiety and depression. And often it does result from shame. And recognizing that, yeah, if you were to look at your role here and your purpose, and whether or not you believe in God, I think still finding that alignment in terms of how are you acting in this world. And I think that's where people are really falling short with themselves, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're not acting in alignment, right? And I tend to see that with a lot of people where they're like, oh, no one's going to know if I'm behaving this way. No one's going to find out. And especially they'll be like, God's got bigger things to worry about. Or there's so many 8 billion people, maybe I may get missed. But at the end of the day, however you rationalize it, you still have to live with yourself, right? You're spending time with yourself all the time. So I think that's where a lot of that stuff does come into play, where you are feeling that whatever it is, the fact that you're not honoring yourself, that's where I think a lot of these issues do arise for individuals. So then
Yep,
I guess,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So how does that, and I guess for listeners then, what's your background in terms of what's allowed you to come to this point in your life and then wanting to write this book to address some of these things?
Yeah, definitely. So, to be honest, okay, first of all, I had cancer as a very small child. My earliest memories are me sitting in a hospital room with either my parents or my grandma. And it sounds weird to say that having cancer would be the best time of anybody's life, but I was too young to understand that I was sick. And I just had these little four walls of love that was just that that sacred space where I felt completely like happy and protected, right? And then I went to school and I always was that girl who had one best friend, one female best friend. And I wasn't very social otherwise. And a lot of my first experiences with really feeling bad about myself had to do with being self-conscious about the fact that I was weird or something like that. And and that's pretty normal. My I grew up in a pretty secular liberal environment, and neither of my parents were religious. They didn't stay together long after I went into remission. And we just had a very like I want to say like normal for people who grew up in the early 2000s. Like it's more common in our generation to grow up in a split household than to have two parents who are married.
Mhm.
And of the kids who I knew who had two parents in the house together, like the vast majority of them were first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants. But like I went to high school in Ann Arbor and it was so obvious that all of the kids whose parents were Americanized had like really either dysfunctional marriages or split households. And then the kids whose parents were coming from a different culture had stable marriages. And this was a really weird phenomenon for me to describe because no one around me, like none of my teachers had really articulated this phenomenon. So this was just something that I was observing as a child. And so my mom's mom is one Arab American woman who was shielded from this collapse of like social order because she was operating in a cultural context that was on the borderlands of another culture. So I learned a lot from her. And I also, as an adult, retroactively went back and I was like, why is this one person in my life the only person like with a functional like system of functional relationship? There's one person I know who has really functional relationship and she's um not associated with this culture that the rest of the people who I know are in. So that's how I came to it. And then as a college student, um, I really regressed in college in terms of how good I felt about myself. And that had something to do with the fact that like I kept putting myself in situations where I allowed people to judge me. Like I was really worried about not having enough friends or whatever. Like, you know how girls feel like that in middle school? Like I was really worried about that in my 20s.
Mhm.
So I kept joining these stupid clubs with people who I didn't like, because I wanted the appearance of friends. And inevitably, I couldn't sustain those relationships because pretending to fit in with people does not give you lasting relationships. You're not going to feel accepted if you're accepted for who you're pretending to be. If I'm significantly conforming my personality and my behavior in order to fit in with you guys, then you guys don't like me for me. And it's not a fulfilling relationship anyway. And I know that now, but I didn't know that in my 20s. And then also, I got an Instagram. I had an Instagram and a Snapchat before then, but the fact that I had a public scoreboard of how many people thought I was pretty or thought that I was interesting or whatever compared to every other woman I knew, I got about 100 to 160 likes per post on my Instagram, which is like an insanely high number of posts if you think about it in terms of personal interaction. If 150 people gave me a compliment in a single day, that would be insane, right? Um, but when, but a lot of the girls who I was interacting with and who I was friends with online were pulling about 300 to 400 likes per post, which meant that I was about 1/3 to 1/2 as popular as the rest of my peers. And I always had a public scoreboard to show me that and to show me that I didn't really fit in.
Yeah.
And the whole like count thing really sent me over the edge. It really did. I obsessed about it. I was upset that not enough people liked my graduation post when I was 22 years old. So I messaged my friends. I was like, can you please like my post so I can get it up past this? It's so sad. I think it's so funny that that in this entire time, over the 2-year period, that I was so enthralled with this that it didn't occur to me to just delete the app. And then you can just get over it. Eventually I deleted it. And being able to remove myself from situations where people publicly judged me did wonders for my mental health.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think, yeah, that's the biggest issue I've seen in society right now. And I don't think it only applies to the younger generation. I think everyone's falling into the trap, the comparison trap. And we tended to do it obviously in different ways before social media. We look at your neighbor, you look at your friend, what car are they driving, what kind of house are they living in. But now it's in your face, and you can basically compare yourself to anyone, whether it's professionally, is this person doing better than me professionally? It could be socially, it could be personally. Oh, this person got married again or has this many kids and everyone looks happy. And there's so many different layers of comparison now. It's hard to even get your head out of it. So I think that is the huge issue. And I wonder if there's studies being done to understand or find some correlation between people's mental health and their social media use. That'd be very interesting to see. So I think you shared around your experience in college, but then what did you do professionally or academically to then to understand this as being a larger issue and recognizing perhaps that you were also struggling with it in the past? And then I guess what motivated you to then write a book about it?
Mhm. So I studied Arabic language and comparative literature when I was in college. So I got proficient in Arabic and I read chapter books in it. And then I also got proficient in Spanish and I read chapter books in Spanish. And I really like literature. The basic way that you professionally read a book is you have to connect your emotions to the emotions of the character. And then you have to try to understand what this is saying about people or the human condition. And the thing that comparative literature, as opposed to English, does is it forces you to read books that are further and further away from your own human experience so that you can create that connection of empathy with a man from the 600s or a man from the 1800s in Haiti or whatever it is, right? At the time that I was studying comparative literature, there was a really big emphasis on decolonization and uplifting the voices of people in the Americas who had previously not been read as much, right? there was a big emphasis on that. I also chose to study Arabic and I was really good at it. And actually, for a long time, I thought that I was going to get a PhD. But unfortunately, I was not, I wasn't ready to do that at the end of college. And really, I had some dysfunctional relationships with professors who I thought would be able to write me recommendations or really make me feel good about being in academic settings. But there's a disease in academia right now. Like, I'm not even like actually, so many people who end up getting PhDs are so unhappy. They're the people who, especially the females who end up getting PhDs, often don't have children, or if they have children, it's really difficult for them to continue with their work. And just like the amount of people who lean towards heady stuff tend to be a little bit more neurotic than the rest of the population, right?
Yeah.
And I fit in. That's good for me. I like that environment. But the number of people who are so unhappy who are getting PhDs just scared me. So I ended up pulling my PhD applications at the end of my senior year. I was going to do it. And then I said, no, I can't do it. The end of my senior year was the beginning of COVID. And I was like completely broken. I was like living in my grandma's house in mid Michigan and I couldn't get a job anywhere. And I had pulled my PhD apps and I was like, I need money. So I started working at the Amazon warehouse at a DTW5 Sort Center. And honestly, just as an anecdote, I'll answer your question, but just as an anecdote of my experience working in the Amazon warehouse, I met a lot of people who I really like and respected. And one of those people makes feature length films in between his shifts at the Amazon warehouse. And I saw them and it's actually like really good. So if you want to check out Joe Brown, he makes really awesome feature length films and he does it on a very minuscule budget. And he's able to coordinate like entire like casts of people over long periods of time to make these films. It just proves that artistic expression is not something that only elite people do.
Right.
So the problems that people talk to me about in the Amazon warehouse were so different from the problems that I had been experiencing before that it was actually really good for my mental health to be in that environment, to get a grip on reality. So anyway, I had a really strong academic foundation. I had published twice in college in journals in creative writing. I had
Yeah.
published in Universal Table, and I also published in Tulip Trees, Stories That Need to Be Told anthology. And then coming out of college, I got into Sad Girls Club literary magazine. So I had been writing for a while. And then I just needed to take time to process how badly how I can reclaim inner peace. I was like, I'm going to intentionally think about this. I'm going to sit there and think about it for a very long time. And that's what this book is. It's me talking to you about how I came to inner peace. And I hope that it can help you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing all of that. And it is interesting to talk more about this issue we're seeing in the academic space, and especially with colleges and universities. It's become a fairly large issue. You're seeing a lot of, I think, personal views being pushed down on people. And if you don't ascribe to that view, then you tend to get ostracized or even socially isolated. And if you're going to be spending 4 or 5 years working on a thesis or whatever it is you need to do to get your PhD, that could be toxic. And I compare it to being in a workplace where your values don't align with your employer. How long can you survive there? And what is the impact it has on your mental health? Yeah, I
Yes.
wanted to get your thoughts on that. And what are you seeing? There's a lot of talk about it right now in terms of just the whole foundation falling apart right now in terms of the academic world.
Yes, you said it exactly. I was trying to dance around that point, but yes, that's exactly it. People who do not ascribe to the most stringent fundamentalist version of outrage culture can often get bullied. And for example, I had an experience with a teacher. She had a picture of a baby on the frame of her door. And I walked in one day and I said, "Oh, is that your grandchild?" She's a little bit older. So I asked her, "Is that your grandchild?" And she got really quiet. And I knew that I had offended her. So I just asked her whatever question I needed to ask her. And then she said, "Follow me." And she walked me down to the department chair's office. And she took me in front of the office. The office was closed. And she said, "When you came into my office, you didn't ask me about my academics. You only asked me about my reproductive capabilities. The only thing that you care about is my uterus." And I said, "I'm so sorry. Doctor, I really didn't mean to offend you. I'm so sorry." And she didn't stop. It didn't occur to her that I was also a female. It didn't occur to her that if she had been a man who had a picture of a baby on her door, I also would have asked that man, "Is that your grandchild?" And she ended up sending me 2 follow-up emails about it, like 3 weeks after this happened, because she was really offended. And eventually, at the second email, I was done with this because, like, previous to that, another person who I had never interacted with personally said that I offended their social identity when I had never talked to them. So it was really stupid. That's an entire other story. But I was really like, oh my gosh, this professor is sending me an email 3 weeks later because I asked about a picture of a baby. So I reported it to the Office of Respect, and the Office of Respect said, "Look, we're going to have a mediated conversation between you and her because clearly you did something to offend her and you need to apologize for offending her. And then she needs to talk it out with you." And to be honest, an environment where I tell that story and they think, "Oh yeah, you definitely Jane Marie did something a little wrong, and then the teacher did something." The culpability lies equally with both parties. The interpretation of this story that the culpability lies equally with both parties is insane. It's absolutely insane, and it's only justifiable in university culture right now, right? That's not feminism. That's not furthering the rights of women. That's just being crazy.
Mhm.
And I don't really know how someone functions in the world if that's the way that they act and think. But the point is that in academia, I told other people about this and I sought help because this professor was acting this way. And they were like, "Oh yeah, it's 50-50. You need to apologize to her again." So that's just an example.
Yeah, I think to your point or question around how do these people function in the world, they're not in the real world, right? Created this environment where a lot of the times, and you see this all across the board, people will surround themselves with others that tend to reinforce their beliefs and values and behaviors. So ultimately, you
Right.
just survive with that because everyone around you is acting the same way or is ascribing to your view. So you're not really getting challenged. I tend to see that a lot. And when people like that do get challenged, they're outraged because they, I don't know, I try to have compassion, but it is hard at times because it's like, that's not reality. So they have this distorted sense of reality, unfortunately,
Uh-huh.
which cause a lot of issues, but it is quite a problem right now. And circling back on where we started this conversation is not necessarily a Gen Z problem right now because we're seeing it all across the board with all people. And if you, again, it's easy to basically cancel someone nowadays. You don't agree. on thing or views.
Yeah, it is. It's really easy to cancel people. And to be honest, the outrage mob cancels the wrong people a lot. And when you go after a political figure that has like genuine power and has done something genuinely unacceptable, it's one thing. Like canceling Harvey Weinstein is one thing, but like canceling a woman because she didn't let someone who she didn't know into her condominium, that's the type of thing that create like creates resistance to your movement, right? Like I just like to point out to people who are doing cancel culture that like during the Spanish Inquisition, if you accepted Catholicism, they stopped torturing you. Okay, they didn't continue once you ascribed to their beliefs. But with modern cancel culture online, like you can apologize 1,000 times and they will still contact your employer to take away your job. And it's at this point, it's just like I'm not going to apologize if I offend people anymore. I'm just like, nothing that I say ever has bad intentions. Not like I don't talk to people about emotions and their experiences and my experiences with the intention of hurting them.
Mhm.
Obviously, I want to help, and that's why I'm talking. And I think of myself as doing something that is good. So if you can't engage with me respectfully enough, if you can't accept that what I'm saying is coming from an open and willing heart, then then there's nothing to talk about. And yeah, it's just really sad. Really, like the mob is controlled by the lowest common denominator of stupid, and it hurts a lot of people. It also prevents real justice from going forward. So,
I think for people, because they've created so much of their identity and everything about them is online now, they don't really have a personality or identity outside of that. So that's where people feel threatened too by the cancel culture.
uh
So that probably a good segue into what we wanted to touch on. I know we went off at a bit of a tangent here, but coming back to the whole notion of the ancient way of perhaps not even calling it mental health, but dealing with it and really having that question of the soul, because I think it is, we are in a society where that whole notion is gone right now. That's why you're seeing some of these behaviors. So I do think there is an overlap between the two. But what, so just sharing your thoughts around that, because you did touch on it in terms of, okay, maybe the depression is grief. It's not so debilitating that you can't deal with it. And then the whole notion of ascribing to the soul and recognizing that. What are your thoughts on that, and how can people apply that in their lives? Because I think another piece I see where people have so much anxiety is they just feel like this is it. Your presence in this world, that's it. And you die and poof, you're gone. So I think that creates that whole scarcity mindset for people, delusion and anxiety as well.
for the people who think that there's nothing beyond this world, I would ask them, has anybody ever treated you badly? Has anyone ever done something wrong to you, right? Because if you believe that there's no such thing as right and wrong, then you can't claim that anyone has ever done something bad to you, right? Um, the gauge by which we decide what is right and wrong isn't socially learned, because if it was, then you would never disagree with the moral principles that were taught to you, right? You have this internal sense that you should be treated a certain way, right? And that internal sense exists beyond society. It's not purely relativistic, is what I'm saying, right? So there's a philosophy of morality called relativism, which is that you're just taught whatever, right? and then you believe what you are taught. I think that relativism is incorrect, and I think it's incorrect because I know that people should treat me a certain way. And if that's true, then there is a certain standard of behavior that exists outside of space and time that human beings are held to. Philosophers have called this the moral impulse. Religiously, you could say this is the desire to connect with God. Or that's the God, I don't know, it's some scripture, like God put it in our hearts that we'll seek him or something. So that's the Abrahamic way of thinking about it. I also know that the writings of Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching assumes that people should act a certain way. This moral impulse is not strictly Abrahamic, but I don't know a lot about Eastern religion. I want to read that, but I don't know a lot yet. So just talking about Abrahamic faith, there's a moral impulse in humanity, right? And really, there's no human society that has existed that doesn't have some code of how you should behave, right? There are societies that will say that some behaviors are acceptable, whereas other societies say that they're not. But there's no behavior there's really no society on record that's just anything goes, right? Like all people have this feeling that their behavior matters beyond the immediate material consequences. And that isn't explained by science. And so answering your question about how people feel purposeless, nihilism is a philosophy that requires a human being to completely separate the most magical thing about them. In order to believe in nihilism, you have to believe that you do not have this impulse. And personally, I think that it is true that human beings are infinitesimally small compared to the vastness of the universe. It's also true that the atoms that make us up you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. We're a carbon-based life form, and carbon is also what makes up dirts and rocks and stuff, right? It's not that those things are not true. It's just that those things were not the focus of religion, right? Religion, the Abrahamic faiths were not preoccupied with the fact that human beings are made from dust. They mention it on the side, and then they go on and they say, hey, you have a moral impulse, and that is the only thing that matters. That is the only thing that has, like, human beings ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it made them human. But the knowledge of good and evil made us human. The moral impulse is the thing that distinguishes humanity from the rest of us. And it's not that you have to believe in scripture to understand the value of this system of belief that has sustained humanity for the past 4,000 years. So I would say that the connection between morality and God is the essence of purpose. And also, if you want to respect yourself, you could act respectable, and then you'll respect yourself like you respect another person. That's my...
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think the whole idea behind nihilism, I think Nietzsche predicted that when he said God is dead, right? And that's the society we live in. So it is interesting. I think the moral kind of behavior around that too, for people, really holding yourself accountable. And again, everything we've touched on, when we tend to focus on controlling others and focusing on what they're saying or how they're behaving, that's where we get lost. And that's where we're stuck in society, why there's so much polarization. If you can perhaps take that step back, and I know you talked about the Abrahamic faith-based, even the scripture coming from all three religions, that's the idea, is hold yourself accountable, because at the end of the day, when you do die, the only actions you have to speak for are yours. Those are
Right.
the ones you get judged on. So that to me, as difficult as it is, trying to hold myself accountable to my choices is the only thing I can really focus on. The rest is out of my control, even including how other people respond to my positive behavior. If I'm being generous, if I'm being charitable, others are not receiving that positively. That there's nothing I can do about it. Or if they disrespect me for it, again, it's out of my control. So trying to, and I think that's also impacted my mental health for a very long time, was getting lost in that. What is this person thinking about me, or what are they saying about me? And that can often cause a lot of distress too.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Exactly right. Um, you are not judged by how other people treated you in this life. You are judged by how you treated other people.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes
absolutely.
sense.
No, thank you, Jane Marie. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on here, sharing your story, and kind of sharing your own thoughts and wisdom around where you think we are right now and what can help. But for listeners that want to find your book, or perhaps even find you online, what are some ways they can do that?
My book is on Amazon and on barnesandnoble.com. It's called Screens and the Ego by Jane Marie Outrage. And you can also go on my website. I have my email address up on my website. So if you'd like to send me an email, I'd love to hear from you guys. And also, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's really wonderful. And I really have appreciated the conversations that you've done in the past. I think that they're really smart, and they are probably helping your listeners get a grip on what they need to really control. So thank you so much for all you do. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.